Hello everyone. Today's article is titled Japan's Surrender Delayed by Propaganda from Soviet Agents. My name is Satoshi Hamada. I used to be a member of Japan's House of Councillors. I am now trying to return to national politics. As part of that, I am practicing English so I can talk with leaders around the world. Today is September 11th, 2025. It's 10 o'clock p.m. And now I'm in Kurashiki City, Okayama Prefecture. Today I'll talk about a Japanese article on the internet. It says that Soviet agents spread propaganda during World War II. Because of this, Japan's surrender was delayed. If you want to read the article in Japanese, please check the link in the description below. After World War II, it can be said that the US government under President Roosevelt effectively created the occupation policies for Japan. The reason we know now that the Communist Party had a strong influence on these policies is because the secret Venona documents were made public. Mr. Michio Ezaki, a critic and historian of intelligence, has taught us about this hidden part of modern history. The OSS, which later became the CIA, was full of Soviet spies. From 1942, members of the Communist Party had infiltrated many parts of the US government, especially important departments like the Department of Agriculture, Treasury, Budget Bureau, State Department, and the agencies like the Foreign Economic Administration, WPB, OSS, and OWI were deeply affected. One organization we should pay attention to is the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS started as the COI, a coordinator of information, created directly under the president in July 1941, 5 months before Japan and the US went to war. It was renamed OSS in June 1942. The OSS uh, collected global information and planned not just the war effort, but also how to manage other countries after the war. President Roosevelt wanted the US to become the new world leader after the war, replacing the British Empire. The OSS was trusted by other departments as a fair and accurate source of information because it was a secretive agency. Most people didn't know what was going on at that time. But now we know it had main communist agents. The leader of the OSS until its disbandment in September 1945 was a military man named William Donovan, but his top deputy, uh, Duncan Lee, was actually a Soviet spy. Lee had access to all the top secret documents that came to Donovan. Even more shocking, Duncan Lee was in charge of the OSS Japan division. Under Lee control, the Japan division of OSS created major post-war policies for Japan, like the Tokyo trials, the order to suppress Shintoism, the new constitution, and changes to the education system. In effect, the U.S. occupation policy for Japan was created by a coalition of the Roosevelt Democratic Administration and the Communist Party. But we only learned about the strong communist influence after the Venona documents were classified, declassified. And some people say it's terrible that the America forced Japan into an unfair occupation. They imposed a constitution and disbanded the military. But more accurately, it was the Roosevelt Democrats and the American Communist Party that imposed these policies. After Japan lost the war, its fate was in America's hands. But America itself was being influenced by the Soviet Union. By the way, the CIA, the intelligence agency created after the war, was formed based on the OSS. It's important to remember that the CIA began as an organization full of Soviet agents. The Soviet operation to prevent Japan's surrender. During the war, President Roosevelt's U.S. government demanded that Japan surrender unconditionally. But unconditional surrender could mean Japan would be turned into a slave nation. So Japan's government and military had no choice but to continue fighting. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan on August 8, 1945, exactly 3 months after Germany surrendered on May 8th. This matched the deadline set by the secret Yalta Agreement, where the US and UK promised huge Asian territories and interests to the Soviet Union if it joined the war against Japan. From August 9, the day after Soviet entry, to August 14, when Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration, the Soviet gained control over Outer Mongolia, southern Sakhalin, the Kuril Islands, and Manchurian parts and railways. Even though Japan had surrendered, the Soviet Union continued fighting until August 22. The illegal occupation of Japan's northern territories happened during this time. Manchuria was the most industrial region on the Chinese mainland, thanks to the infrastructure built by Japan. The Soviet Union took control of this rich area, along with huge amounts of weapons and factories left by the Japanese army. Some of this military equipment was handed over to the Chinese Communist Party. Under the excuse of preparing for war against Japan, the Soviet Union also received massive amounts of food, fuels, and supplies from the United States. The US also gave the Soviets over 700 small warships by the end of the war and even trained their crews. Thanks to the Yalta Agreement, the Soviet Union gained everything it wanted without much effort. After Germany surrendered in May, Japan's surrender was only a matter of time. But the Soviet Union did not want Japan to surrender too early, before it could join the war and claim its promised rewards. If Japan surrendered before the Soviet entered the war, the, they would lose the land and interest promised in the Yalta deal. So even though Japan was already close to collapse, the Soviets wanted to delay its surrender as much as possible. Roosevelt's insistence on unconditional surrender. The Soviet Union first launched propaganda to justify its entry into the war against Japan. They told US leaders that the Japanese military was still strong and that only a land battle on the Japanese mainland could force Japan to surrender. At the same time, they blocked any reports that said otherwise. This kind of disinformation was spread within the US military and government. According to the book Stalin's Secret Agents, General George Marshall and his staff at the War Department pushed the idea that the US Army needed the Soviet Union's help against Japan. Although Marshall later became known for the anti-communist Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe during the war, he was extremely pro-Soviet. The Soviets also pushed the US to take a hardline stance toward Japan in peace negotiations. They made sure that the US demanded unconditional surrender and presented harsh post-war plans so Japan would hesitate to surrender. In fact, the Roosevelt and Truman administrations both refused to guarantee the emperor's safety, which delayed Japan's decision to surrender. President Roosevelt became Stalin's best helper in this strategy. Many top American generals were deeply concerned and trying to warn Roosevelt. They told him that demanding unconditional surrender would only make Japan fight even harder, prolonging the war and increasing Allied deaths. Even so, Roosevelt insisted on unconditional surrender. After the war, congressional investigations, witness testimonies, and media reports showed that many U.S. military leaders had opposed the idea that the Soviet Union's help was necessary. In the Navy, famous admirals like William Lee, Ernest King, and Chester Nimitz were against Soviet invasion of Japan. Still, President Roosevelt remained firmly committed to his unconditional surrender policy. However, in April 1945, Roosevelt suddenly passed away. Vice President Harry Truman became the new president. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman was not forced on demanding unconditional surrender. Because of the brutal battles uh, at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Truman's administration began to consider allowing Japan to surrender under certain conditions. If Roosevelt had lived longer, it's possible that Japan might have been forced into last stand battle on its home islands. Uh, Thank you very much for watching this video. Now let me talk about something very important. NHK, Japan's public TV station, is a big problem. It often supports China's ideas. NHK sends out TV signals without asking. If you don't pay the fee, NHK staff come to your home to ask for money. This system is old and very unfair. When I was in the diet, I worked hard to fix this problem. It was my top promise in the 2019 election. And now, as always, uh, I I say this. I will say this. By increasing the number of people who don't pay the NHK fee, we will destroy NHK. Thank you again, and see you in the next video.